A procession will take place through the streets of the Brazilian city of Santos later today for the footballing legend Pele, before a private family ceremony and his burial. The player, who was the only person ever to win the World Cup 3 times, died last week at the age of 82. Our South America correspondent Katie Watson reports.
What a send-off for Brazil's king of football as he began his final journey. Pele came home to Santos Football Club, his coffin laid on the pitch where he made his name. Brazilians didn't want to miss their chance to pay their respects, a moment for reflection and sadness that this great presence has gone. The queue began at dawn and grew throughout the day. Despite the searing summer heat, Brazilians young and old came from far and wide to see the man who revolutionised football and made this country famous.
He's the #1 ambassador of this country in the world, in my opinion. So if you travel abroad and you talk about Brazil, the first word you see coming back is you are from the Pele's country.
We grew up with him, especially the streets that I grew up. He used to go to the supermarket. Every day we say hello to Pele. That was normal for us.
I never saw him play, this little boy told me, but we'll really miss him because he was the best footballer in the world. And for those who knew him well, the memories kept flowing.
He was a fantastic person. He had a generous heart, he was kind, not just because he was the athlete of the century, but he was a simple man. He always looked after people in a really sincere way. He was humble, and that's my biggest memory of him, of Pele, as a man and a great athlete.
As the sun went down, the people kept coming.
The queue kept on growing throughout the day, and just look at it now, overnight. I spoke to one Brazilian who said, "We don't have a monarchy. Pele was the closest thing to it. People here just want to say goodbye."
Tears, emotion and celebration of their king. His biggest fans said goodbye to Pele in style. From here, the coffin will be taken through the streets of Santos ahead of a private family burial. Katie Watson, BBC News in Santos.
Let's talk to Tim Vickery now, an expert in South American football, who is joining us from Rio de Janeiro. Good to have you with us. Thanks for joining us, Tim. I know you're in Rio, but events from Santos are being televised across the country, aren't there? Have you ever seen anything like it before?
Well, I suppose there is a comparison with the death of Ayrton Senna, the Formula One race driver in 1994, which was, I think, more hysterical because he died in action at the peak of his powers. The case of Pele didn't come as a surprise. The country was braced for it. We had a little pause over the weekend. Saturday was obviously New Year's Eve, and Sunday was the inauguration of the new president, Lula, who's on his way at the moment to Santos to participate in the wake and at the procession. And that little pause, I think, tended to add gravitas to the occasion. It's very solemn. There aren't that many people, I think, in floods of tears, but it's a solemn recognition of the importance of this man who at the moment lies in state for the next 3 hours in his field of dreams there at Santos. And to push the field of dreams comparison a little bit further, I think we've clearly seen that if you build a wake for Pele, they will come.
How is he being remembered there? Is it as arguably the greatest footballer of all time, or is it more than that?
I think it is more than that. I think, and we got a flavour of that from the people that Katie was talking to. Remember, 9-year-old child watching his father cry, listening to the radio as Brazil lose the World Cup in 1950, when they're still wearing white shirts. You fast forward just 20 years, and Pele and Brazil have won the World Cup for the 3rd time. Now in yellow, that yellow shirt is established as an iconic image of the nation, which is seen as the guardians of the beautiful game. And Brazil have become the country that wins, the country that wins in style, the country that wins in style with a smile on their face. It's the country that then everyone wants to be for 4 weeks, once every 4 years. So he is, without doubt, the greatest ambassador that Brazil has ever possessed.
He wasn't always a unifying force, was he, in Brazil itself, because of his forays into politics? And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about his time, for example, when he was sports minister.
Well, his time when he was sports minister is interesting because he brought in, this is in the late 90s, he brought in freedom of contract for Brazilian players. And he said at the time that there was a recognition that at the peak of his powers as a player in the late 60s and early 70s, he hadn't done enough to help his fellow professionals. And this has been a criticism which has been leveled at him, that he didn't use his voice enough in the cause of Afro-Brazilians, for example. There's an obvious comparison with Muhammad Ali, a near contemporary who gave up the best years of his career to take a political stance. But the context of Pele is very different. One, he doesn't have the Vietnam War to mobilize against, as Ali did, but also the racial context is different in Brazil. Brazil imported millions more enslaved Africans than the United States, which meant that in the States, the white power structure could always separate black from white, draw a line there. Not true in Brazil, colonized by a small country like Portugal, where they even encouraged Catholic priests to go and multiply. They needed people. So the line between black and white never been particularly hard and fast. And that meant that in the case of Ali, Ali had a movement behind him because it was clear who was on his side and who wasn't. There was a movement to educate Ali, a movement to back him up. Pele had nothing like that. He had to chart his own course. So sometimes I think these criticisms are a little bit unfair, and maybe we expect a little bit too much at times from our sporting idols. He wasn't perfect. Some of the coverage of him wanders a little bit into hagiography. He wasn't perfect, but the example that he set, born 52 years after Brazil abolishes slavery, a one-time shoeshine boy who ends up shining more brightly than anyone else in the history of football. I think that example of being the best, I think that is worth much more than any declarations that he might have made or not have made.
Tim, we don't have much time, but I do want to ask you one final question. We know that Brazil is polarised politically. It suffered a great deal with the pandemic, and yet Brazilians appear to have come together, don't they, to have mourned Pele's death. I wondered whether you think it's realistic to think that he might make a long-term difference in the country.
I don't think so. I think that football is one thing and feeding your family is another. He's an example of a Brazil that works, but the challenge in front of this country now is to multiply the biography of Pele, not just in football, not just in music, but in other fields. Can there be a mass investment in education, for example, to have Pele's in the urban periphery included in a modern economy? Now that's a huge challenge, and football is never going to solve that one on its own.
Tim Vickery, we must leave it there, but thanks so much for your thoughts and insights. Thanks.
My pleasure. Thank you.